It was meant to be a whisper, but it turned into a kiss by mistake. The palace fell silent. Everyone felt the weight of that moment between a human and the long-eared queen. The first thing he learned about the palace was that silence there was never truly empty. It had weight, direction, even intention, as if every corridor listened, every polished surface remembered. When his boots touched the smooth, reflective floor, the faint echo did not travel freely. It seemed to be absorbed, studied, and then allowed to fade with reluctant permission. He adjusted his posture without realizing it, straightening just enough to feel slightly less like an intruder. It didn't work. The attendants lining the passage noticed everything. They did not turn their heads much, but their long, elegant ears shifted in subtle, synchronized movements, like delicate instruments tuning themselves to his presence. He briefly wondered if they could hear his thoughts. The idea stayed with him just long enough to make him consciously think nothing at all, which, unfortunately, made him think about everything. "Relax," he muttered under his breath, then immediately regretted it when the small translator device at his collar whispered his words aloud in a slightly too formal tone. "Please engage in relaxation." One of the attendants' ears twitched. "Great," he added quietly. "Magnificent," the device corrected. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, inhaled, and decided that from now on, silence might be his best diplomatic strategy. The doors ahead did not open so much as unfold. Layers of material, metal, light, something in between, peeled away with a fluid grace that felt almost organic. Beyond them, the throne chamber revealed itself not with overwhelming grandeur, but with a kind of restrained precision that made everything inside it feel deliberate. Nothing was excessive, nothing was accidental, and at the far end she stood. He had been told what to expect, of course. Briefings, images, carefully neutral descriptions. None of them had prepared him for the strange familiarity of her presence. If not for the long, refined ears that curved gently upward from her head, she could have passed for human at a glance. But even that comparison felt insufficient. There was a stillness to her, a composure that did not come from training, but from something far older, far more ingrained. Her gaze met his before he had fully processed that he had entered the room. That was new. Most leaders he had encountered preferred to make people wait, to assert control through delay. She did not. She observed immediately, directly, as if the concept of hesitation bored her. He stepped forward, counting his pace out of habit, then realized halfway through that he had forgotten how many steps he was supposed to take before stopping. The result was a brief, awkward adjustment where he slowed, then slightly sped up, then stopped with a confidence that convinced absolutely no one. He bowed, not too low, not too shallow, somewhere in the carefully calculated middle that had been drilled into him repeatedly. He held it just long enough to be respectful, then rose, hoping the moment had passed cleanly. It had not. A faint ripple moved through the attendants, not sound, not quite movement, but something perceptible. He resisted the urge to check if he had somehow bowed in the wrong direction. "Human," the queen said. Her voice was calm, measured, and carried effortlessly through the chamber without the need for volume. The translator rendered it perfectly, which was both a relief and slightly disappointing. He had half expected it to turn into something absurd. "That is correct," he replied, then paused, realizing that confirming his own species might not have been the most impressive opening. A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, touched her expression. "You are aware of where you stand," she continued. "I am," he said then, because his mind chose that exact moment to betray him, added, "I believe so." The translator hesitated for just a fraction too long before repeating it. "I believe so." He winced internally. Her gaze sharpened not in anger but in interest. "You believe?" "Yes," he said quickly, then forced himself to slow down. "I was briefed extensively, though I have been told that direct experience tends to adjust expectations." "Adjust," she echoed. He nodded once. "Sometimes dramatically." A pause followed, not an uncomfortable one, not entirely. Just long enough for him to become aware of his own breathing again. "And what have your expectations become?" she asked. He considered giving the safe answer, the practiced one, the one that would pass through the room without friction. Instead, something else slipped out. Less certain, he said. Another small shift in the room. This one felt different. The queen tilted her head slightly, the motion subtle but deliberate. One of her ears angled just enough to catch the nuance in his tone. Uncertainty, she said, is often regarded as a weakness among your kind. It is, he admitted, which is why we get very good at pretending we don't feel it. That earned him a reaction. Not from the attendants, they remained as composed as ever, but from her. It was brief, almost imperceptible, a softening at the edge of her gaze. Pretending, she said. Yes, he replied. We specialize in it. Then you are either very skilled, she said, or very honest. He allowed himself a small breath. I'm hoping for a strategic balance of both. The translator paused again, then delivered it with perfect clarity. No unexpected vegetables, no alarming reinterpretations. A small victory. She stepped forward. It was not a large movement, but it changed everything. The distance between them shortened just enough to make the space feel more personal, less ceremonial. He resisted the instinct to step back. Up close, the differences became more apparent. Not just the ears, though they were striking in their own right, long, elegant, subtly expressive, but the way she held herself, the way her gaze seemed to settle on details and extract meaning from them without effort. You are not what I expected, she said. He let out a quiet breath. That makes two of us. A faint sound escaped her, then soft, controlled, unmistakably a laugh. It lasted no more than a moment, but it traveled through the chamber with far more impact than any formal declaration could have. And just like that, the silence changed. The first thing he noticed about the room was that nothing in it seemed willing to stay still unless it absolutely had to. The walls shimmered faintly, not in a distracting way, but like they were thinking about moving and hadn't quite decided yet. Even the light felt adjustable, as if it might dim itself out of politeness if anyone asked. He stood at the center of it, alone for exactly 3 seconds before realizing that he was definitely not alone. Don't react, he whispered to himself. Do not react, the translator repeated with impressive clarity. Something behind him shifted. He closed his eyes briefly. I really need you to stop doing that. I require clarification, the device replied. Of course you do, he muttered. A soft sound followed, barely there, like fabric brushing against air. He turned slowly this time, committing to the idea that if something strange was going to happen, he might as well face it with dignity. There were 3 of them now. They hadn't been there before. He was almost sure of that. They stood in a loose formation, watching him with a calm attentiveness that felt far more intense than outright hostility. Their long ears angled toward him in slightly different directions, like they were each listening to a different version of the same conversation. Hello, he said. The translator hesitated. Greetings of socially acceptable neutrality, it finally produced. He blinked. That's new. None of them spoke immediately. Instead, one of them stepped forward with a precision that made it seem rehearsed, though the slight tilt of her head suggested curiosity rather than formality. You speak to yourself, she said. He nodded. I find it helps me stay organized. Organized, she repeated. Yes, without it, things tend to collapse. Another one of them shifted slightly, her ear flicking in what he was beginning to suspect might be the equivalent of amusement. You appear functional, she said. I aim for that, he replied. On most days. There was a pause, not empty, never empty, but filled with the kind of quiet evaluation that made him aware of every small movement he made. He resisted the urge to adjust his stance again. You have been granted proximity, the first one continued. That sounds significant, he said carefully. It is, she replied. He considered that. Is it also dangerous? All 3 of them looked at each other, not with their eyes. Their ears moved, subtle, coordinated shifts that passed something between them faster than words could have. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Good, I like knowing where I stand. That is unlikely, another one said. He smiled faintly. That's been a recurring theme. A faint hum passed through the room then, low and almost melodic. He glanced upward, noticing for the first time that the ceiling wasn't entirely solid. Patterns of light moved across it, forming shapes that didn't quite settle into anything recognizable. What is that? He asked, The translator paused. Decorative existential uncertainty, it said. He stared at it for a second. I'm starting to think you're doing this on purpose. I do not possess intention, the device replied. Sure, he said. The first attendant stepped closer. Not enough to invade his space, but enough to make the distance feel deliberate. You were observed, she said. I assumed as much, he replied. I tend to stand out. You do, she agreed. He shifted his weight slightly. Is that a problem? That depends on another pause, longer this time. On whether you continue to be interesting. He let out a quiet breath. That's a lot of pressure. It is not intended as pressure, she said. It feels like pressure. That is a human interpretation. He nodded slowly. We have a lot of those. A faint sound came from the side, almost like a suppressed laugh. He glanced toward it, catching the briefest change in expression before it vanished again. You find this amusing, he said. No, the third one replied immediately. He raised an eyebrow. That sounded like yes. It was not, she said. He looked between them, then sighed lightly. You're very good at this. At what? The first one asked. Making conversations feel like puzzles. That is because you are solving them incorrectly. He smiled despite himself. I was afraid of that. Another hum moved through the room, slightly louder this time. The light above shifted, casting a softer tone across the space. You will be summoned, she said. That sounds important, he replied. It is. He hesitated for just a moment. And if I'm not ready? All three of them focused on him again. You will be summoned, she repeated. He let out a small breath. Right, of course. The translator remained silent this time, which he took as a sign of either improvement or quiet judgment. They began to move, not away from him, but around him. A slow, deliberate circling that wasn't threatening so much as thorough, like they were trying to understand him from every possible angle without touching him. He stayed still, mostly because he wasn't sure what would happen if he didn't. You are uncertain, one of them observed. Yes, he said. You admit it easily. I've found it saves time. Another small shift, another almost laugh. That is inefficient, she said. Probably, he agreed, but it's honest. They completed the circle and returned to their original positions as if nothing had happened at all. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, try not to misstep, the first one said. He frowned slightly. That sounds like advice. It is, she replied. I thought you didn't do that. We do not. He blinked. You just did. Another pause, then it is an exception. He exhaled slowly, a faint smile forming despite the tension. I'll do my best. That may not be sufficient. It rarely is, he said, and for just a second barely there but real, the silence around them shifted into something lighter. The chamber felt smaller this time, though he was fairly certain it hadn't changed. The distance between him and the Queen remained exactly as before, measured and intentional, but something about the air made every step feel more noticeable, as if the floor had developed a personal interest in his coordination. Walk normally, he whispered. Proceed with standard locomotion, the translator announced. He didn't break stride, but internally something gave up. By the time he reached the marked position, he assumed it was marked, though nothing visible confirmed it. He stopped with what he hoped looked like confidence and not the result of careful guesswork. The Queen was already watching him. She always was. You return, she said. I do, he replied, then added, intentionally. A faint shift passed through the court. He was starting to recognize it now, the subtle ripple of restrained reactions carried not by voices but by those elegant, ever-expressive ears. One of them flicked slightly to the side, which he was almost certain meant someone had just been entertained. Intentional actions are generally preferred, she said. I'm relieved to hear that, he answered. Accidental ones tend to be more memorable. That earned him something, not quite a smile, but close enough to count as a victory. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It stretched, adjusted, settled around them like a living thing deciding where to rest. He had begun to understand that these pauses weren't gaps, they were part of the conversation. You have adapted, she said after a moment. I'm attempting to, he replied. There's a difference. Explain. He inhaled lightly. Adapting suggests success. Attempting suggests ongoing negotiation with failure. Another faint ripple. This one lingered longer. You speak of failure without discomfort, she observed. I prefer to introduce it early, he said. That way it doesn't feel left out later. A brief, unmistakable sound escaped her, soft, controlled, but undeniably a laugh. Somewhere behind him, someone inhaled too sharply. He didn't turn. He had learned that lesson. You are unusual, she said. I've been informed, he replied. Repeatedly, I suspect. Enthusiastically, he said. The translator delivered it flawlessly this time. He was beginning to trust it again, which probably meant it would betray him soon. She stepped down from her elevated position. Not a dramatic descent. No grand movement. Just a single step forward that changed the entire structure of the room. The distance between them shortened, and with it, the invisible line of formality blurred just enough to become uncertain. He remained still. Mostly. His instinct to adjust his stance returned, but he suppressed it with impressive effort, which unfortunately resulted in him standing just slightly too rigid, like someone pretending not to be nervous. You calculate your movements, she said. Yes, he admitted. Why? Because not calculating them seems risky. Her head tilted slightly, one of her long ears angling toward him with precise attention. And yet, she said, you still miscalculate. He hesitated. That sounds like a leading statement, he said carefully. It is an observation. Those can be dangerous, he replied. For whom? He allowed himself a small breath. Historically, me. Another pause. This one felt different, not heavier, sharper. She took another step closer. He became aware of details he hadn't noticed before, the subtle shifts in her expression, the way her gaze settled not just on him, but on specific parts of him, as if reading something written beneath the surface. It wasn't invasive exactly, just thorough. You are aware of the protocols, she said. I am, he answered. You understand their purpose. I believe so. That earned him the slightest narrowing of her gaze. You believe. Yes, he said. I found certainty tends to collapse under close inspection. A faint sound came from somewhere to his left. He ignored it. Then inspect this, she said. He blinked once. That sounds like a test. It is not, she replied. That makes it worse, he said. A flicker of amusement again. Step closer, she said. There it was. The kind of instruction that sounded simple until you realized it was. He hesitated for exactly half a second, then stepped forward. The distance between them shrank to something undeniably personal. He was now close enough to notice the fine details, the almost imperceptible shifts in her breathing, the way her ear moved slightly as if adjusting to the proximity, the way her gaze held steady without any sign of retreat. This is closer, he said quietly. It is, she replied. Is this within protocol? No, he nodded once. I suspected that. Does that concern you? Yes, he said immediately, then added, but not enough to step back. Another ripple, this one stronger. Her gaze sharpened, not in warning, but in something far more complex. You are aware of the consequences, she said. I am aware that they exist, he replied. The details feel flexible. They are not. They rarely are, he said. A pause, longer now. The kind that stretched just enough to become noticeable. He became aware of his own breathing again. The position of his hands, the exact angle of his shoulders. All the small, insignificant details that suddenly felt very significant. Why do you remain? She asked. He frowned slightly. I was instructed to. That is not what I asked. He exhaled slowly. Because stepping back now would feel like a mistake, he said. And stepping forward, she asked. He considered that. Also a mistake, he admitted. A flicker of something passed through her expression, quick, sharp, gone almost instantly. Then you are positioned between errors, she said. Yes, he replied. It's a familiar place. Another small step, not from him, from her. The distance vanished, not entirely, but enough. Enough that he could feel the subtle shift in the air between them. Enough that any further movement, intentional or otherwise, would matter. You should be precise, she said softly. I'm trying, he answered. Try harder. He let out a quiet breath. That's usually when things go wrong. Then perhaps, she said, you should stop trying. He blinked. That feels like very risky advice. It is not advice. Of course it isn't, he murmured. A pause, a small shift. A fraction of movement that didn't quite align with intention. He leaned in, not much, just enough to close the distance required for a quiet word. She did not move away. For a single, suspended moment, everything aligned, the angle, the distance, the intention. And then it didn't. A miscalculation so small it barely existed. His words never reached her ear, because something else did. The contact was brief. Unmistakable, impossible, and the palace stopped. No movement, no sound, no breath. Even the ever-present, living silence seemed to hesitate, as if unsure how to proceed. He froze. She did not move. Not immediately. Time stretched. Collapsed, refused to function. Somewhere far behind him, something made a very small, very unfortunate sound. It echoed, loudly, and just like that, the moment became real. The palace was quiet again, though this time the silence carried a different weight. It wasn't the tense, measured hush that had marked his first days here, nor the curious, evaluative pauses that had followed in the weeks since. No, this silence felt elastic, stretching comfortably between people, absorbing missteps and misunderstandings rather than magnifying them. He found himself walking through it with a sense of ease he hadn't known he could feel inside these walls. He had survived the miscalculations, the misunderstandings, even the accidental kiss that had thrown the court into temporary chaos. And in doing so, he had learned something invaluable. Confidence was less about certainty than about knowing how to respond when everything went wrong. The Queen was waiting for him in the same chamber, though the space now felt less intimidating and more hospitable, if that word could ever apply to a place governed by centuries of protocol. Her posture was relaxed, one hand lightly resting on the edge of a sleek metallic console that pulsed softly with alien energy. The gentle hum of the devices embedded in the room seemed to acknowledge him now rather than scrutinize him, their vibrations almost conversational in tone. "You have returned," she said, her voice carrying the same measured calm, yet tinged with a subtle warmth he had not recognized before. "I have," he replied, and this time he allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "I've learned that retreating rarely solves anything." Her long ears tilted slightly, as if in approval. "Nor does hesitation." He chuckled quietly. "Neither does overthinking. I may have miscalculated more than I anticipated." "You have miscalculated," she said, and he braced himself, expecting the familiar tension, the evaluative pause, the quiet judgment. Instead, she smiled. Not fully, but enough to transform the air between them. "And yet, here you are, without damage sufficient to be irreversible. That counts as progress." He allowed himself a little laugh. "Progress rarely comes without a mess attached." "Mess," she repeated. "It is often the precursor to clarity." He looked around the room, taking in the soft, shifting walls, the hovering holographic interfaces that had once seemed alien and intimidating. Now they felt like companions, silent witnesses to a strange, precarious friendship that had formed through mistakes, humor, and the occasional breach of protocol. "So I've contributed to clarity?" he asked, half joking. "Unintentionally," she admitted. "But yes, you have shown adaptability." He nodded slowly, letting her words settle. Adaptability. That had been the lesson buried under the layers of etiquette, technology, and alien custom. It was not that he had learned all their rules. It was that he had learned how to survive when the rules bent or broke entirely. He had learned that mistakes could become opportunities, that humor could diffuse tension, and that a misstep, if handled carefully, could reveal truths no formal ceremony ever would. "You have become less predictable," she said, her voice softening slightly. "And in this court that is unusual." "I'll take unusual," he replied, his smile growing. "Predictable tends to get you ignored or, worse, misjudged." Her ears twitched in what he decided was a gesture of agreement. "You have also humanized the court," she added, almost conspiratorially. "Through your presence, through your willingness to engage rather than retreat." He raised an eyebrow. "Humanizing a court of centuries-old protocol, that sounds ambitious." "Perhaps," she said, "but you have achieved it nonetheless." For a moment, he considered the journey that had brought him here. The awkward introductions, the misunderstandings, the moments of intense observation, the accidental breaches that could have been disastrous. And of course, the kiss, the catalyst that had thrown everything into chaos and yet somehow became a turning point. He realized that the very thing that could have ended his mission instead became the defining moment of his presence, a lesson in the unpredictable alchemy of human error and alien grace. "I think," he said slowly, "I've learned more here than I could have anywhere else, not just about your customs, but about approaching the unknown without fear." She inclined her head, her gaze steady. "And have you found fear?" "Certainly," he admitted. "But I've learned to make room for it, rather than let it dictate my actions." "That is wisdom," she said. Her expression softened in a way that made him realize she regarded him not merely as a visitor or diplomat, but as a participant in something far larger, a living experiment of interaction and trust across worlds. He allowed himself to take a step closer, intentionally, this time aware of every movement, yet free from the paralysis that had gripped him before. "Then perhaps the next step," he said lightly, "is to navigate the rest of this palace without tripping over its history or my own 2 feet." Her laugh, soft and deliberate, filled the room. It was no longer the cautious sound of evaluation or the faint amusement at his earlier miscalculations. It was genuine, warm, and unrestrained, echoing through the chamber and bouncing off the reflective surfaces in a way that felt like the palace itself had been invited to relax. "You may," she said, her tone hinting at both humor and challenge. "But remember, adaptability remains key." "I'll keep that in mind," he said, smiling, "though I suspect the palace may test me anyway." "Indeed," she said. "And you will respond." For the first time, he realized. He straightened his shoulders, took a measured breath, and stepped forward with a newfound ease, aware of every detail, every observer, yet unburdened by fear. The Queen watched him, her expression unreadable for a moment, then softened in acknowledgement. "You have changed," she said quietly. "And so have I," he replied, "in ways I did not expect, but ways that matter." The chamber hummed gently around them, as if recognizing the resolution, the closure, the strange harmony born from chaos and careful missteps. For the first time, he felt truly integrated, not just into the court, but into a world that had seemed impenetrable, incomprehensible, and distant. He understood now that growth was rarely linear, that humor could bridge gaps that diplomacy could not, and that even the smallest errors could reshape reality if approached with awareness and courage. The Queen inclined her head once more, a subtle gesture of finality, of understanding, and perhaps of approval. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile, and the palace seemed to exhale with him. The journey was complete, not in the sense that it had ended, but in the sense that he had arrived, aware, resilient, and ready for whatever came next. The corridors, the walls, the soft, shifting lights, they all felt